Welcome to the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA, Introductory Course on Protected Species and Habitat. This course is provided by the Florida Department of Transportation, or FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM. This training is part of a series of introductory courses that provide guidance on FDOT's process for complying with NEPA, called Project Development and Environment, or PD&E. Please see the Environmental Management Academy course catalog and the FDOT Learning Curve or the OEM website PD&E training track for other computer-based trainings in this series. Several of these trainings are referenced throughout this computer-based training, or CBT. A link to these sites can be found at the end of the CBT on the resources page. The environmental review, consultation, and other actions required by applicable federal environmental laws described in this training are carried out by the FDOT pursuant to 23 U.S.C. Section 327 and a Memorandum of Understanding dated December 14, 2016, executed by the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, and FDOT. This course contains 4 lessons which introduce protected species and habitats and discuss the regulatory agency processes and FDOT procedures and emergency consultation. More information on the topics provided in this course can be found in Part 2, Chapter 16 of the PD&E Manual. The chapter entitled Protected Species and Habitat outlines procedures for determining the effects of transportation projects on protected species and habitat. You may want to have this chapter handy as you go through this training. This chapter is available on FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM's website, using the link below. This link can also connect you to other chapters of the PD&E manual that are referenced throughout this training. Both the chapter and training also provide guidance on coordinating with natural resource agencies to ensure compliance with the Endangered Species Act of 1973 as amended, and the Florida Endangered and Threatened Species Act, Section 379.2291 Florida statute. This chapter and course also provide guidance on documenting protected species and habitat impacts, coordination with natural resource agencies, and related commitments in the environmental document and accompanying technical memo or natural resources evaluation. Guidance on consultation with natural resource and regulatory agencies, documentation, and procedures during design, permitting, and construction phases, as well as emergency consultation with resource agencies, is also provided. Before we delve into the process for determining the effects of FDOT's projects on protected species and habitats, it is important to understand the historical context that led to the protection of these resources. First, let's define some terms that will be used throughout the rest of this training. The term protected species is used as a general term for species that are protected by law, regulation, or rule. When the term listed species is used, it refers to species that are identified as threatened or endangered at the federal or state level. Critical habitat can refer to either 1. The specific areas within the geographical area occupied by listed species on which are found those physical or biological features, A, essential to the conservation of the species, and B, which may require special management considerations or protection, or 2, to specific areas outside the geographical area occupied by the species at the time it is listed. The action area of a project refers to all areas that are anticipated to be affected directly or indirectly by the federal action. This term does not refer merely to the immediate area involved in the action. Please note that the definitions listed here are not exhaustive. More specific definitions to these terms can be found in the Protected Species and Habitat chapter of the PD&E manual. Over a century before the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, President Theodore Roosevelt was promoting conservation. Often called the Conservation President, Roosevelt created the United States Forest Service and established 150 national forests, 51 federal bird reserves, 4 national game preserves, 5 national parks, and 18 national monuments. Over the course of his presidency from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt ensured the protection of approximately 230 million acres of public land. For example, the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, located off the east coast of Central Florida, was established in 1903 through one of President Roosevelt's executive orders. This land was designated as the U.S.'s first national wildlife refuge to protect egrets and other birds from extinction through plume hunting motivated by fashion trends. In 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, was passed to implement protections for certain species of migratory birds with migration patterns between the U.S. and Canada. One reason behind the enactment of this legislation was that migratory birds help to protect both prairie and forest lands from destruction by hostile insects. Even today, the MBTA serves as one of the primary tools for protecting non-endangered bird species such as the bald eagle and osprey. In 1962, Nature author Rachel Carson published a book entitled Silent Spring, which focused on the largely unknown environmental and health hazards of the pesticide DDT. The book caused an uproar as the pesticide industry attempted to discredit Carson's in-depth research, while grassroots environmental movements began to spring up around the country. Ultimately, the negative effects of unrestricted pesticide use were proven, and the U.S. government began to monitor DDT spraying programs more closely. The use of DDT as a pesticide was eventually banned in 1972. Rachel Carson's book is now often referred to as the inspiration for the modern environmental movement and one of the motivations for the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA. The legislative groundwork for the Endangered Species Act of 1973 was created in 1966 with the passage of the Endangered Species Preservation Act. This piece of legislation created a mechanism for the listing of endangered species and authorized land acquisition by the U.S. government to conserve selected species of native fish and wildlife through habitat conservation. The Endangered Species Preservation Act was amended in 1969 to expand protections for animals threatened with worldwide extinction by prohibiting the import and sale of such vulnerable species in the U.S. Since the focus of this amendment was global in nature, an international meeting was called for to create a global agreement dedicated to endangered species conservation. This meeting was eventually held in Washington, D.C. in 1973 and resulted in 80 nations signing the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES. This agreement regulates and in some cases prohibits the international trade of designated plant and animal species. That same year, Congress fulfilled the U.S.'s part of the CITES agreement by passing the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, of 1973. This law broadened and strengthened existing protections for all threatened and endangered plant and animal species, in addition to codifying the process and procedure by which these protections would be enforced. Further amendments to the ESA were passed in 1978, 1979, 1982, 1988, and 2004 to further clarify the law as necessary. Some of the additions to the law include the designation of experimental populations outside a protected species historical range, the use of incidental take permits, which will be discussed later in this course, and the ability to temporarily list a vulnerable species that has been determined to be significant and immediate danger, termed an emergency listing. The 1979 amendment also created the Endangered Species Act Committee, which has the final say in whether an exemption to the ESA will be granted or not. These exemptions will be discussed further in another lesson. Other applicable environmental legislation includes the Florida Endangered and Threatened Species Act, Section 379-2291 of the Florida Statutes, and Section 404 of the Clean Water Act of 1972. Section 379-2291 of Florida's Endangered and Threatened Species Act defines protections for the state's endangered and threatened species. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, also known as FWC, is responsible for oversight of this legislation and is entrusted to exercise the regulatory and executive powers of the state with respect to wild animal life and freshwater aquatic life and marine life. These powers and duties are embodied in the implementing regulations adopted in Chapter 68 of the Florida Administrative Code, or FAC. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act of 1972, also referred to as the CWA, regulates the discharge of dredged or filled material into the waters of the United States. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, provides oversight of the Section 404 program and policies, while the United States Army Corps of Engineers, or USAC, administers the day-to-day program and is responsible for federal wetland determinations and wetland permitting. Impacts to wetlands and other surface waters provides a nexus for involvement of the United States Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service as consulting federal agencies, where these agencies advise the USAC or other lead federal agency on the potential for wetland impacts to affect federally listed species and their habitat.
Now that we have discussed the historical context that led to the protection of certain species and habitats, we can focus on the regulatory agencies' processes for determining the effects of FDOT's projects on protected species and habitats. FDOT coordinates, consults, and engages with three major regulatory agencies when a project has a potential to impact protected species and/or habitats. The federal regulatory wildlife agencies are the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Marine Fisheries Service, or NMFS. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has jurisdiction over the land and freshwater species protected by the ESA, while NMFS has jurisdiction over protected marine species. These two agencies are referred to as the services in the chapter and this training. The state's regulatory wildlife agency is the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or FWC. This agency has jurisdiction over all species listed in Florida's Endangered and Threatened Species Act. The key elements of successful coordination with these agencies are early, continual, and strategic coordination throughout the course of project development. When project managers routinely adhere to these three generalized coordination principles, there is a high probability that potential or actual protected species and habitat issues will be resolved throughout the project's development. FDOT's Efficient Transportation Decision-Making, or ETDM, process provides agencies and other stakeholders the opportunity for early input and consideration in the environment and FDOT's transportation planning. Some key features of the ETDM process include early agency and community involvement, early identification of potential avoidance, minimization and mitigation opportunities, and identification of potential key issues. Each of the 7 FDOT districts has been assigned an Environmental Technical Advisory Team, or ETAT, which is comprised of staff representatives from participating agencies and stakeholder groups. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, NMFS, and FWC all participate in the ETDM screenings as ETAT members and use the Environmental Screening Tool, or EST, to review project information, review preliminary alternatives, identify potential project effects, and submit comments to FDOT. The EST is a web-based GIS database and mapping tool that provides access to project information and data about natural, physical, cultural, and community resources in the project area. The use of this tool enables the maximized use of technology for agency coordination and project screening. More information regarding the ETDM process can be found in FDOT's ETDM manual. A link to this manual can be found on the resources page of this CBT. For federally funded, authorized, or implemented projects, Section 7 of the ESA requires coordination with the services to ensure that actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of federally endangered or threatened species, or result in the destruction of adverse modification of critical habitat. This shows the contact information for each federal wildlife agency office that serves as an ETAT member and is responsible for Section 7 consultation in the state of Florida. It is imperative that each district coordinates with the appropriate office. Figure 16-1 of the PD&E Manual's Protected Species and Habitat chapter provides a flowchart of the protected species and habitat evaluation process. Every project should be reviewed for the potential presence of protected species and wildlife habitat. If found to be present in the action area, the project's involvement with the protected resource should then be evaluated regardless of funding or environmental document type. First, a preliminary species and habitat evaluation is conducted and documented as appropriate. For projects that qualify for screening, this preliminary evaluation is conducted as a part of the ETDM screening. Then the district determines project involvement with protected species and habitats by reviewing information from the ETDM screening, if applicable, and gathering information from various sources. All information on protected species and habitats is compiled into FDOT's technical memo or natural resource evaluation. If federally listed species or critical habitat are present within the action area, then consultation is necessary. Consultation may be as simple as a brief, informal consultation or more in-depth formal consultation. Additionally, if state-listed species are present or expected to be present within the action area, then coordination with FWC is recommended. As a general rule of thumb, coordination with the applicable agencies should be conducted as necessary throughout the entire protected species and habitat process. Remember, continual coordination throughout the course of the project development is one of the 3 key elements of successful agency coordination. Finally, the district must document all wildlife agency decisions and any commitments made to wildlife agencies in the final environmental document prepared for the project. Impacts to protected species and habitats should also be addressed in this document. We will be going over this protected species and habitat evaluation process step by step in lesson 3. As mentioned previously, coordination is required for federally funded, authorized, or implemented projects to ensure that actions are not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of federally endangered or threatened species, or as a result of in the destruction of or adverse modification of critical habitat. It is highly recommended that the districts reference the Endangered Species Consultation Handbook located in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's website if federally listed species or designated critical habitat involvement is possible. A link to this handbook can be found on the resources page as well. Regardless of project funding, the district must coordinate with the services if the project may affect federally listed species or critical habitat. Coordination should occur for each listed species and/or each type of critical habitat within the action area. As part of this effort, the district should make individual effect determinations for every listed species and/or designated critical habitat. This is necessary because the level of federal coordination required ultimately depends on the effect determination reached for a given species or critical habitat. There are 3 possible effect determinations that can be made for a listed species or designated critical habitat. A no effect determination means no effect whatsoever, neither detrimental nor beneficial to a species or critical habitat is anticipated in the short term or the long term. Consultation with the services is not required when this determination has been made. A may affect is not likely to adversely affect determination means that all effects to a listed species or designated critical habitat are anticipated to be beneficial, insignificant, or discountable. Informal consultation is required when this determination is reached. FDOT should submit a copy of the technical memo or NRE to the applicable services for review, along with a letter requesting concurrence on the effect determination. Formal consultation or avoidance measures may be needed if the service does not concur with a determination that the project is not likely to adversely affect protected resources. A may affect, likely to adversely affect determination indicates that listed resources are likely to be negatively affected by the project. This determination triggers the need for formal consultation, which must be initiated by FDOT's Office of Environmental Management, or OEM. Remember that consultation with the services is necessary every time a may affect determination applies, regardless of whether it is likely or not likely to adversely affect listed species or designated critical habitats. Figure 16-2 of the PD&E Manual's Protected Species and Habitat chapter provides a flowchart that serves as a useful aid for each listed species and/or critical habitat that may be subject to federal coordination. Both the informal and formal federal coordination and consultation processes are outlined here. Please note that although consultation is not required for a no-effect determination, the analysis supporting it should still be documented in the project file, technical memorandum, or natural resource evaluation, also called NRE, as appropriate. Results and any coordination with the services should be documented in the final environmental document. Informal consultation is the vehicle for determining the potential for adverse effects on a federally listed species or critical habitat, identifying ways to avoid them, and resolving project conflicts or misunderstandings. Informal consultation may necessitate preparation of an official species list and/or the completion of a technical memo or NRE by the district. The districts initiate informal consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife or NIMS as appropriate. Coordination with OEM or other lead federal agency or an other lead federal agency may occur as necessary. When a may affect, not likely to adversely affect determination is reached, the district should prepare a technical memo or NRE. OEM should review the NRE before the district submits it to the services for review, along with a letter requesting concurrence on the effect determination. During informal consultation, the districts and the services work together to evaluate potential impacts on listed species and eliminate or reduce potential impacts where possible. In many cases, the ultimate effect determinations may be influenced by project modifications. FDOT and the services may engage in continual coordination to reach agreement on effect determinations and project modifications necessary to accommodate particular listed species. If the service agrees with the effect determination, it will document that agreement with a concurrence letter. If the service does not concur, a non-concurrence letter will be sent to FDOT. Formal consultation is a formal process with prescribed timeframes that may be required for any project regardless of the class of action. FDOT and the services work together to determine if options exist that could allow the action to advance without jeopardizing the species' existence or adversely modifying or destroying critical habitat. Although OEM must initiate formal consultation, the district works closely with OEM and the services throughout the formal consultation process. Formal consultation cannot be initiated until the NRE is completed and reviewed by OEM. If the district determines that the action or project may affect is likely to adversely affect listed species or designated critical habitat, then the district must request via email that OEM, as a lead action agency, initiate formal consultation. OEM, with assistance from the district, then sends a written request to the services, which includes an initiation package describing the project and its relevance to federally listed species and habitats. Once initiated, the formal process has several prescribed timeframes. These all will be discussed later in this lesson. The formal consultation process results in a biological opinion, or BO, that is prepared by the services. This document determines whether the proposed activity will jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species, known as jeopardy, or destroy, or adversely modify critical habitat, known as adverse modification. When a BO results in a non-jeopardy conclusion, it will contain an incidental take statement. The incidental take statement documents the extent of anticipated take of listed species caused by the proposed action and provides exemption from Section 9 of the ESA, which specifically prohibits the taking of protected non-plant species. In this context, take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. Also contained in the incidental take statement are any terms and conditions required to minimize and monitor the impacts of anticipated take on the protected resources. These terms and conditions are non-discretionary measures that are necessary and appropriate to minimize the impact of incidental take if an exemption from Section 7, subsection A2 of the ESA is to apply. To clarify further, Section 7, subsection A2 of the ESA contains language which directs all federal agencies to ensure that any action they authorize, fund, or carry out does not jeopardize the continued existence of protected resources unless such agency has been granted an exemption by a specially convened Endangered Species Act committee. During formal consultations, the key to reaching non-jeopardy opinions is to focus on the avoidance and minimization of project impacts, not compensation strategies. Jeopardy and adverse modification conclusions are made at the listed species population level rather than the individual level. If the BO reaches a jeopardy or adverse modification conclusion, it will include reasonable and prudent alternatives and associated reasonable and prudent measures for implementing the project to avoid jeopardy or adverse modification. Note that the services should include the action agency and applicant in developing reasonable and prudent alternatives and measures. Depending upon project-specific circumstances, several reasonable and prudent alternatives may exist. Only one alternative may exist, or no alternatives may exist. Reasonable and prudent measures are the non-discretionary or mandatory actions developed for each alternative, which are necessary for a given alternative to avoid a jeopardy or adverse modification opinion. The reasonable and prudent measures developed for each alternative may be the same or different, depending on the alternative. FDOT may adopt the reasonable and prudent alternatives or measures, as well as not advance the project or modify the action or offer reasonable and prudent alternative or measures not yet considered and reinitiate consultation, or proceed with the action if, upon review of the BO, FDOT believes that such action satisfies Section 7, subsection A2 of the ESA, or requests an exemption from Section 7, subsection A2 of the ESA. Note that this last option is not typically used by FDOT. Whatever the decision, FDOT must notify the services of its final decision on any proposed action that receives a jeopardy or adverse modification biological opinion. To date, there have been no jeopardy conclusions made for any FDOT projects. As long as FDOT continues to practice early, continual, and strategic coordination throughout the course of project development, this is likely to remain the case. As mentioned previously, the formal consultation process has multiple prescribed timeframes. Once the initiation package is received, the service has 30 working days to review the package for completeness and should provide a written acknowledgement of the consultation request to the action agency. Within the 30-day period, the service must advise the action agency of any data deficiencies and request additional information to complete the initiation package. The formal consultation period officially begins when the service determines that the initiation package is complete. The ESA and Section 7 regulations require that formal consultation be completed within 90 calendar days upon request of the required information. The service strives to issue the BO during the formal consultation period, but must deliver the BO to the action agency no later than 45 calendar days after the conclusion of formal consultation. This 45-day period is often used by the action agency and the service to review and refine the BO. Keep in mind that environmental investigations, reviews, and consultations are intended to be coordinated as a single process, and compliance with all applicable environmental requirements are to be reflected in the environmental document to the fullest extent possible. If consultation cannot be completed in a single process, the district should coordinate with OEM to determine the appropriate course of action to advance the project. From start to finish, the entire process can take up to 135 days after initiation of formal consultation, so make sure to plan accordingly.
Proposed species are those that are proposed in the Federal Register to be listed under Section 4 of the ESA, which outlines the processes for listing species, designating critical habitat, and developing recovery plans and monitoring systems. Species in critical habitat proposed for listing may require a conference with the services if agency action is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of such proposed species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of proposed critical habitat. Informal conference is an early interagency coordination similar to informal consultation, where the services assist in determining effects and may advise on ways to avoid and minimize adverse effects to proposed species or critical habitat. Following informal conference, the services issue a conference report containing recommendations for reducing adverse effects. These recommendations are advisory until a listing becomes effective, but following the recommendations helps avoid future conflicts and the need to reinitiate consultation once the species is listed or critical habitat is designated. Formal conference must be initiated by OEM and is required when a project is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a proposed species or is likely to adversely modify proposed critical habitat. Formal conference procedures are the same as formal consultation. The opinion at the end of formal conference is a conference opinion and follows the contents and formats of a BO. When a species is listed or critical habitat is designated, the services have the option of adopting or the conference opinion as the BO or for the project. An incidental take statement issued with a conference opinion does not become effective unless the services adopt the conference opinion as the BO. Candidate species are not proposed for listing, but are species for which the development and publication of proposed rules for listing are anticipated. Effective candidate species conservation may reverse the species decline, ultimately eliminating the need for ESA protection. Section 7 consultation is not required for candidate species, though consideration of conservation measures may help to minimize project delays if a candidate species becomes federally listed before construction of a project has been completed. Several species that are not federally listed and therefore not subject to ESA review may be protected by other federal regulations such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or MBTA, and/or the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. Pursuant to the MBTA, it is unlawful to take, possess, buy, sell, purchase, or barter any migratory bird, including feathers or other parts, nests, eggs, or products, except as allowed by implementing regulations. It should be noted that all non-exotic birds in the state of Florida are protected by the MBTA. Rules promulgated under the MBTA prohibit the destruction of active nests, which contain eggs or flightless young, without a federal permit. The Federal Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act prohibits anyone from taking, possessing, or transporting a bald eagle or golden eagle or the parts, nests, or eggs of such birds without prior authorization. This act affords protection over inactive nests as well as active nests. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has bald eagle monitoring guidelines that provide information for applicants proposing construction activities occurring within 1,500 feet of an active bald eagle nest during the nesting season. Note that a permit may be required when proposing constructive activities under these circumstances. Coordination with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission focuses on state-listed wildlife species and habitats, as well as other protected species such as the gopher tortoise and Florida burrowing owl. The procedures for coordination with the FWC are not as rigidly prescribed as those for the federal process, but the general process, overall goals, and documentation requirements are similar. FDOT places the same emphasis on early, continual, and strategic coordination with FWC to ensure that state-protected species and habitat issues are considered from the earliest planning phase and carried through the PD&E, design, and construction phases of the project. In order to avoid regulatory duplication for threatened and endangered species, the following state rule applies. Activities that result in take or incidental take of federally designated endangered and threatened species do not require a permit from the Commission when authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. Some species that are federally protected may also require coordination with FWC, such as Florida manatees and sea turtles. For projects that qualify for ETDM screening, the ETDM process initiates the project-level coordination with FWC. The FWC ETAT representative provides focused comments and a list of state-listed species or otherwise protected species that should be considered during the PD&E study. As the coordination with FWC progresses throughout the PD&E study, issues related to particular state-listed species, other protected species, and habitats are addressed. Many of these issues will be addressed through the NRE, which is submitted to FWC as part of the coordination process. FWC decisions are documented via correspondence and/or memos. The FWC typically requests that effect determinations, similar to those made for federally listed species, be made for state-listed species. The three effect determinations used for FWC coordination are no effect anticipated, no adverse effect anticipated, and potential for adverse effect. Commitments to FWC, such as wildlife crossings or species-specific surveys, are recorded in the environmental document. Species-specific surveys or permitting may be necessary after conclusion of the PD&E phase. Decisions made during coordination and FDOT commitments to FWC should be documented to facilitate the transfer of information and commitments to subsequent project phases. Any assumptions such as road alignments and/or conditions such as species-specific surveys that are associated with FDOT's commitments to FWC must be included in the environmental document. Some of these commitments may be part of a permit or permit conditions in future phases. FWC is divided into 5 administrative regions. This slide contains the contact information for each FWC regional office in the state of Florida. Note that FWC ETAT are the points of contact for the districts. Each district should coordinate with the appropriate office when needed. Under federal law, activities that may impact federally listed plant species are subject to regulation under the ESA. However, destruction, damage, or relocation of protected plants is not prohibited unless these activities take place on federal lands or are otherwise in violation of state law on other lands. In cases where projects may impact lands under federal jurisdiction, such as National Park Service lands, national wildlife refuges, and areas designated as critical habitat, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service can determine through Section 7 consultation that there are no other options available and that the action will not jeopardize the continued existence of the species. In those cases, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service may authorize destruction of plants on federal lands. Input from the ETAT representatives during ETDM screening should identify federally listed plant species that may occur within the action area. Coordination with the appropriate agencies for federally listed plant species is always included as part of the federal consultation process, and any listed plant species are potentially present. Should federally listed plant species be identified within the action area, the need to be considered together with listed wildlife species during consultation. Based on consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, listed plants may be moved to suitable habitats to avoid direct impacts. The only federally listed marine plant species, Johnson seagrass, or Halophila johnsonii, requires coordination with nymphs when a project may cause direct or indirect impacts. Johnson seagrass occurs only in coastal environments of southeast Florida between Sebastian Inlet and central Biscayne Bay. Critical habitat for this species has been designated in 10 distinct locations within its range. This slide shows the 10 distinct Florida locations designated as critical habitat for Johnson seagrass. Please note that these locations encompass both the substrate and water present in each area for projects potentially impacting critical habitat for the species. Coordination with nymphs occurs under the general federal consultation process. If needed, the geographic coordinations of these areas can be found in 50 CFR 226-213. State-listed plant species are regulated by the Florida Department of Agricultural and Consumer Services, or FDOT. But state regulation only addresses the harvesting, transport, and/or sale of listed plant species. The plant species listed by the state as endangered, threatened, or commercially exploited are included in the Regulated Plant Index found in Rule 5B 40.0055 of the FAC. State rules do not specifically regulate or prohibit the incidental taking of state-listed plants in the course of project activities, but general principles of avoidance and minimization also apply to projects impacting these plant species. In cases where known occurrences of state-listed plant species will be unavoidably impacted by project activities, the impacted plants may be transplanted to appropriate habitats nearby as a minimization or conservation measure. This relocation is often completed by contractors or others rather than FDOT employees. FDOT notifies FDACs and the Endangered Plant Advisory Council when bids for construction projects are first advertised according to Chapter 5B 40 of the FAC. Now that we have discussed the regulatory agency process, we can discuss FDOT's procedure for complying with this process. This lesson will cover a lot of material, but the general rule of thumb is that projects not qualifying for screening have no significant effects and do not require detailed evaluations. They typically require a flexible approach, but due to their less complex and comprehensive nature, the evaluation can be streamlined. On the other hand, a higher potential for protected species and habitat involvement usually exists with transportation projects qualifying for screening. These project classifications may warrant a more detailed level of analysis for species and habitat issues during the EST screening process. The level of assessment and documentation during the PD&E phase depends on the potential for protected species and habitat impacts. The protected species and habitat evaluation is intended to be flexible regardless of whether a PD&E phase is warranted or not. FDOT determines what is reasonable in the given context. If an impact is identified, it should be assessed regardless of the nature of the project. Protected species and habitat involvement may be identified for projects that do not require EST screening and advance straight to the design phase. For transportation projects not qualifying for EST screening, the protected species and habitat evaluation should be in sufficient detail to ensure that the project considers protected species and habitat. For these projects, FDOT typically makes a no effect or a may affect not likely to adversely affect determination since no significant effects are anticipated. Keep in mind that an effect determination of may affect not likely to adversely affect requires concurrence from the service. Sometimes species-specific conditions may be required to make this decision. If coordination is needed with the services, additional documentation in the form of a technical memo will suffice, and an NRE is typically not necessary. If it is determined during this coordination that formal consultation may be needed, the class of action may need to be developed through the minor categorical exclusion or MICE process. However, it is possible for formal consultation to be initiated by OEM for a Type 1 categorical exclusion and for the process to result in a may affect not likely to adversely affect determination. Be sure to coordinate with OEM to determine if the class of action can remain as a Type 1 or if the MICE process will be needed. Detailed evaluations are typically unnecessary, but any decisions and conditions should be documented in the project file, summarized in the environmental document, and addressed through incorporation into the final design plans. The project file for all environmental documents, regardless of class of action, should include a summary of listed species and habitat impacts, agency coordination, and compensation for impacts as appropriate. Type 1 categorical exclusions, or CEs, may involve listed species and critical habitat as long as the documentation demonstrates that proposed project has no significant effects on them. Mark the appropriate box on the Type 1 CE checklist in the Statewide Environmental Project Tracker, or SWEPT. Ensure that all supporting information to the checklist is documented in the project file as appropriate. If a technical memo is prepared, reference it in the checklist and include it in the project file. If this analysis indicates a significant impact, the project cannot be processed as a CE. Agency coordination letters are also included in the project file, and any concurrence letters are attached to the form. For a non-major state action, or NMSA, mark no on the non-major state action checklist and SWEPT to document that there are no listed species or critical habitat affected by the project. For these projects, include a summary of listed species and habitat impacts, agency coordination, and compensatory mitigation for impacts as appropriate in the project file as supporting information to the NMSA. If a technical memo was prepared, reference and include it in the project file. Some Type 2 CEs may not require screening through the EST. For these projects, listed species and habitat impacts are documented as if the project was screened. Further guidance on a Type 2 CE documentation is provided later in this training. Transportation projects qualifying for the EST screening are generally more complex. In accordance with Part 1, Chapter 2 of the PD&E Manual, class of action determination for highway projects qualifying projects must complete the ETDM programming screen and may also have completed the planning screen. Detailed evaluations may be necessary for these types of projects. As projects advance, protected species and habitat issues should be considered throughout all phases of the project delivery, including the planning and programming screen evaluations, PD&E evaluation, final design, and construction. At each of these phases, the district should identify potential species impacts and fill in information gaps as feasible. Coordinate with the services and/or FWC as necessary, and develop, refine, and implement mitigation strategies and commitments as appropriate to ensure compliance with federal and state species laws. For projects qualifying for EST screening, the proposed project is entered into the EST. The Advanced Notification, or AN package, may be distributed as part of the programming screen in the EST and includes a preliminary environmental discussion, or PED. Protected species and habitat information is included in the PED, reflecting the district's initial consideration of the project's potential involvement with protected species and habitat resources. The PED should also identify the location of federally designated critical habitat and provide a description of how protected species and habitat are to be evaluated in the PD&E study. The AN may also include a list of permits and a list of technical studies that may be needed. As ETAP members, the services and FWC review the project, respond with comments, provide a species list, and identify any critical habitats within the action area. The ETAT should provide focused comments and actionable recommendations to avoid or minimize potential effects to protected species and their habitat. They should also identify potential permits, compensatory mitigation opportunities, technical studies, and other items within their jurisdiction or responsibility. The EST reports and stores the ETAT review in the programming screen summary report. This report provides a foundation for project managers to coordinate directly with the services and FWC. During PD&E, FDOT uses resource agency comments and information included in the programming screen summary report to determine the project's involvement with protected or proposed species and designated critical habitat. The district should review ETAP comments for the wildlife and habitat issue in the programming screen summary report, as well as ETAP comments on other issues such as coastal and marine, wetlands and surface waters, and water quality and quantity. However, keep in mind that the associated degree of effect from the agencies is not an official finding. Listed species and habitat impact assessment and informal or formal consultation with the services are not initiated until the PD&E phase. The ETDM coordinator and project manager should coordinate internally with permit coordinators, district environmental offices, and others who may be involved in the project following the screening. Upon initiating the PD&E study, the district should coordinate with the services and/or FWC to discuss comments from the programming screen, summary report, and ensure that the potential protected species and habitat have not changed since the screening. This initial coordination is not necessary if the project's PD&E phase begins soon after the EST screen has been completed. The district should collect data and conduct field surveys to identify the initial existing conditions in the action area, such as the protected species and federally designated critical habitat that may occur there, as well as habitat types. The first step when describing existing conditions is to identify the action area. The action area is defined as all areas to be affected directly or indirectly by the federal action, and not merely the immediate area involved in the action. The action area boundaries for the project are established in coordination with the services and other FDOT offices as appropriate. Next, identify protected species and critical habitat that may occur in the action area. This is typically done early on in the development of the PED. However, during PD&E, there may be changes due to the alignment of the project. The federal and state agency online species list, available data sources, current literature, and species specialists may also be consulted to help identify which federal and state listed species may be in the action area. Include species and critical habitats proposed for federal listing, as well as federal candidate species on the list. Federally designated critical habitat within the action area also needs to be identified. Additionally, the species of concern identified by the services and/or FWC during the EST screening should form the basis of a list of species to be analyzed in the PD&E study. Coordination with the service and/or FWC and PD&E may identify additional species to be included on the list. Next, collect data and map habitat. Gather the best and most current scientific and commercial data available to help determine the potential for species occurrence within the action area. Reliable data sources include the service's websites, geographic information systems, species occurrence data, existing studies or surveys, information from past BOs or NREs, status reports and listing rules, critical habitat designations, recovery plans, habitat management guidelines, and species-specific studies. Information on wide-ranging or migratory species that may not be listed by state or federal regulations should be collected since migratory bird species are protected by the MBTA of 1918 as amended. Habitat maps provide a baseline for analysis of species presence or absence and potential impacts. Land covers, land uses, and the presence or absence and quality of suitable habitats and rare natural communities in the project site should be mapped and described. The presence of critical habitat and/or strategic habitat conservation areas, consultation areas, and focal areas should be identified and mapped. The habitat mapping effort should include the evaluation of various existing digital datasets and historical and recent aerial photography. The mapped habitat should be verified with a field survey. Appropriate field surveys should be conducted to determine and record the presence of protected species individuals, evidence of listed species utilization, and document the presence and quality of existing habitats. Areas in which federal and state listed species or species habitat is known or suspected to occur within the action area should be surveyed for individuals or signs of individuals of the listed species. The field survey may result in observations of additional previously unidentified listed species or habitats. Observations of listed species, signs of listed species, and species habitat should be recorded. Global position system coordinates taken, and the quality of habitat should be assessed and recorded. It is recommended that field surveys for federally and state listed species and habitats as well as otherwise protected species be conducted concurrently. This survey is often conducted in tandem with field verification of habitat mapping. During the survey, plant species should be identified and recorded for each vegetative community and dominant species noted for each stratum present. Field surveys for specific species may be required and should be designed to account for life histories and behaviors of listed species with the potential to occur within the action area. Survey design should be considered appropriate time of day and season of the year for species identification, as well as species habitat quality and current site conditions, including but not limited to recent and long-term fire and hydrologic history, recent and current climate events and weather conditions, soil, topographic and vegetative health or disturbances, noise levels, and typical human usage. Some listed species have agency developed or approved survey methodologies, such as the Florida sand skink and eastern indigo snake. More intensive surveys requiring quantitative data are sometimes required as a result of agency coordination. Examples of quantitative data are percent cover for plants and population size for wildlife, such as gopher tortoises. Methods for collecting quantitative data should be provided by the services or FWC during consultation or coordination. Copies of survey results and associated field notes should be provided to the services or FWC soon after surveys are completed. Note that some survey information, such as nest sites, may become outdated after one season. These species-specific surveys are typically not conducted until after the PD&E phase and closer to construction and may be tied to project permitting. If applicable, include in the environmental document that the FDOT will conduct species-specific surveys later in the process. Ongoing agency coordination is needed throughout the PD&E phase. When federal or state-listed species and/or designated critical habitat may occur within the action area, coordination consultation will be needed with the applicable agency and should be documented in the project file. When wildlife crossing features are being considered, follow the FDOT Wildlife Crossing Guidelines, which can be found on OEM's resource website. A link to this website can be found on the resources page of the CBT. These guidelines were developed in coordination with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and FWC. Wildlife crossing feature locations should be identified as early as possible in the project planning and development processes and prior to project design. The guidelines were developed for use by FDOT to evaluate the appropriateness of including upland or wetland wildlife crossings and associated features for proposed projects on the state highway system and establish criteria to be considered during design. In cases where FDOT district has an off-system project, the district will coordinate with OEM regarding possible inclusion of any wildlife crossing features. When making commitments to the services or FWC to address specific protected species and habitat issues of a project, it is critical that appropriate internal coordination efforts within the district, for example, design, permitting structures, construction, and maintenance offices, are completed before such commitments are made. Protected species and habitat analysis during the PD&E phase begins with determining the potential for species occurrence in the action area and identifying any designated or proposed critical habitats. The potential for species occurrence is derived by comparing the habitat mapping of the project site with known species ranges, habitat preferences, and the locations and proximity of known occurrences. This information is then used to evaluate the type and degree of potential impacts, if any, associated with the project. The impact assessment includes comparing the species and habitat mapping data and field survey results with the proposed project footprint to evaluate direct, indirect, and in some instances, cumulative effects to listed species and habitats. If available at this early stage of the PD&E process, plan sheets may be used as a reference for the assessment. Since CEs are generally minor in nature and do not have significant impacts, indirect and cumulative effects assessments will generally not be warranted. There may be exceptions which can be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. It is recommended that the District Environmental Office staff coordinate with the District Design and Permitting staff when conducting the impact assessment. Review the status of designated or proposed critical habitat and the environmental baseline within the action area. The status environmental baseline for any constituent elements may have been modified by actions considered in earlier BOs. The following steps help determine whether a proposed action is likely to destroy or adversely modify critical habitat. 1. Previous BO should be consulted to determine the current baseline. 2. evaluate the effects of the proposed action on the constituent elements of critical habitat. 3, evaluate the cumulative effects on the action area of the critical habitat and its constituent elements. 4, assess whether the aggregate effects of these analyses will appreciably diminish the value of the critical habitat in sustaining its role in both the survival and recovery of the species. The detailed results of the protected species and habitat analysis and impact assessment are documented in a technical memo or NRE and summarized in the environmental document. If more than one alternative is proposed, each alternative is then compared based on impacts to protected species and habitat using the analysis performed and documented in the environmental document. For projects having minimal involvement with protected species and habitat, an abbreviated report in the form of a brief technical memo rather than an NRE may be completed and provided to the services and/or FWC. The technical memo should address the likely effects of the project and document coordination with the services during informal consultation. Technical memo should briefly discuss potential involvement with protected species or habitat and how this involvement is not significant. Any technical memo prepared for a project in which OEM serves as the lead federal agency must include the following statement. The environmental review, consultation, and other actions required by applicable federal environmental laws for this project are being or have been carried out by FDOT pursuant to 23 U.S.C. Section 327 and a Memorandum of Understanding dated December 14, 2016 and executed by FHWA and FDOT. A biological assessment, or BA, is a technical report required by the services if federally listed or proposed species of critical habitat may be present in the action area of a major construction activity. Biological assessment, or BA, is the services term for the document. The Protected Species and Habitat section of the NRE serves as FDOT's BA. Major construction activities are defined as major federal projects significantly affecting the environment. Therefore, most EISs require the preparation of a BA. A BA may be requested by the services for an environmental assessment or EA, but is usually not requested for CEs. If a BA is required or requested by the service, the district should prepare a protected species and habitat section of a NRE to be submitted to the service as a BA. If a BA is not required by the service, then the report may not be necessary and a summary of the NRE components should be provided in the environmental document as normal. However, a BA is always needed for projects which require formal consultation. The NRE includes information on listed proposed and candidate species and associated critical or proposed habitat. The standard technical report cover page, which should be used for the NRE, can be found on the Forms and Procedures Office's Policy and Process Management Unit's website. A link to this website can be found on the resources page. The district should consider commentary from the services and FWC ETAP members and consult with them as necessary when preparing the NRE. The contents are discretionary and coordination with the services and FWC is recommended to determine the depth of detail needed for the NRE. Please refer to OEM's Natural Resources Evaluation Outline and Guidance for more information regarding NRE preparation. A link is provided on the resources page. If applicable, the NRE should include the assessment of impacts to protected species and habitat, wetlands, and EFH as separate actions. The Protected Species and Habitat Evaluation should be the first section titled Protected Species and Habitat. If the project proposes impacts to wetlands, add a section titled Wetland Evaluation. Guidance on preparing the Wetland Evaluation section is in Part 2, Chapter 9, Wetlands and Other Surface Waters of the PD&E Manual. If the project requires an EFH assessment, include a section titled Essential Fish Habitat Assessment. Guidance on preparing this section is in Part 2, Chapter 17, Essential Fish Habitat of the PD&E Manual. The Protected Species and Habitat section of the NRE includes all state-listed species, federally listed threatened, endangered, proposed, and candidate species, and critical habitats, as well as other protected species that may be present within the action area. Information from the programming screen summary report should be used to prepare the NRE and to determine the need for formal consultation or conference. Active coordination with the services also occurs during preparation of the NRE. See OEM's NRE outline and guidance for more direction if needed. Comments and coordination with the agency should be considered and documented in the NRE, and potential impacts to protected state and federal species should be discussed. Individual effect determination should also be made for each listed species and designated critical habitat within the action area. When protected species and habitat section of the NRE is submitted to the services as a BA, the following information is included. Describe the proposed project, including project location, and define the action area. Include all activities related to construction and emphasize both long-term and short-term anticipated impacts in the action area. Project and design alternatives, including construction methods, should also be addressed. Identify the federally listed species, proposed species, candidate species, critical habitat, and proposed critical habitat that occur or could potentially occur within the action area. Provide brief background information on these species in terms of overall range, population status, habitat needs, and life history requirements. Describe the methods used to determine involvement of federally listed species and critical habitat within the action area. Discuss the results of the comprehensive field survey of the project area, describe the survey methodology, and provide details on the qualifications of persons doing surveys. What types of surveys were conducted and on what species, when and how often they were done, and weather conditions. Also discuss the reliability and validity of the survey and assessment and whether future studies may be required to validate and/or update the survey results. Identify any data gaps. Any data gaps or lack of information should be explained and their effects addressed. Describe the methods and results of studies that contribute information relevant to determining actual and potential project impacts on federally listed species or critical habitat. Evaluate the direct, indirect, and cumulative impacts. The NRE should describe direct impacts, which are those effects that occur in direct association with the construction or operation of the project. Indirect impacts, which are those effects that are caused by or will result from the proposed action and are later in time but are still reasonably certain to occur. And cumulative effects, which are defined as those effects of future state or private activities not involving federal activities that are reasonably certain to occur within the action area of the federal action subject to consultation. Discuss efforts, such as precautionary measures, construction design, or conservation measures that will be taken to avoid, reduce, or compensate for any adverse impacts to federally listed species, candidate species, or critical habitat. Conclusions of the services, including recommendations regarding further studies. The final step is to draw conclusions on the significance of impacts to federally listed species and critical habitat within the action area, and any other relevant information. The 10 items just discussed are used by the district to come to an effect determination for each federally listed species or designated critical habitat to be included in the NRE. As a reminder, the determinations are no effect, may affect not likely to adversely affect, and may affect is likely to adversely affect for proposed species or proposed critical habitat. A determination of is likely to jeopardize or adversely modify proposed species or critical habitat is possible. The NRE should also discuss potential impacts to state-listed species and include effect determinations for those species. The report should include information on other protected species likely to occur in the action area. The presence of natural communities should also be identified. Any species-specific surveys or permits that may be needed later in the process should also be discussed. This analysis and any coordination with FWC should be included in the NRE. The district should conduct a quality control review of the document and must submit the draft NRE to OEM for review prior to submitting the appropriate agencies for coordination or consultation. It is recommended that the NRE be provided to the services before submission of a Type 2 CEA or Draft Environmental Impact Statement or DEIS for public availability when feasible, especially if they are a cooperating agency. After OEM review, the NRE can be distributed to the services and cooperating agencies. If the district receives comments from the services, an addendum to the NRE should be prepared. If the environmental document is an EA, EIS, or SEIR, it should also be updated to address comments from the services. For projects with may affect, not likely to adversely affect determinations, the district must send a letter to the applicable service requesting concurrence on federal species effect determinations. The service's response letter should be documented in and appended to the environmental document. For final environmental documents, these effect determinations are used to state the federal findings on listed species and habitat. The NRE and any technical memos should be stored in the SWEPT project file and included as references in the environmental document. When a BO has been prepared, it is important to note whether the agency has requested any reasonable and prudent measures or conservation recommendations. Reasonable and prudent measures are mandatory actions the agency believes necessary to minimize the impacts of incidental take. Conservation recommendations are non-mandatory service suggestions regarding discretionary measures to minimize or avoid adverse effects of a proposed action on listed species or critical habitat. Project documentation consists of maintaining the project file in SWEPT, completing the appropriate protected species and habitat section of the environmental document, and preparing protected species and habitat information for future commitment compliance as appropriate. The district project manager is responsible for collecting and uploading the information gathered during the protected species and habitat evaluation into SWEPT for the project file. All assessment materials, for example, maps, analyses, survey reports, DOT district staff comments, are contained in the project file. All technical reports, such as the NRE or technical memo, agreements, and agency coordination should also be included. Guidance on preparing the project file is in Part 1, Chapter 15 of the PD&E manual. If the project is a Type 2 CE, documentation includes a concise summary of protected species and habitat impacts and agency coordination. This information should be added to the Natural Resource Evaluation section of the Type 2 Categorical Exclusion Determination form. Please note that this form is completed in SWEPT. For EISs, federally listed species and habitat information should be included in the executive summary according to the PD&E Manual Part 1, Chapter 8, Draft Environmental Impact Statement, and Part 1, Chapter 9, Final Environmental Impact Statement. Use the appropriate standard statement in the executive summary for EISs when a no-effect determination is applicable. If disagreements with agencies exist, they should be identified in the Unresolved Issues and Areas of Controversy section of the FEIS executive summary. The discussion of protected species and habitat in the environmental analysis section should include a description of protected species that may occur in the project area, as well as habitat types that may be impacted by the proposed project alternatives. Documentation should also include maps showing the relationship of the project to the protected species identified and the relationship of the project to habitat types. This section of an EIS or EA also includes a summary of the protected species and habitat section of the NRE and presents the results of the impact assessment, effect determinations, and recommended avoidance minimization, compensation for impacts, and enhancement measures. This section should provide sufficient information on the impact assessment such that a reviewer can determine the validity of the methodology. This section must describe the protected species and habitat impacts of the proposed project for each alternative. The information should have sufficient scientific and analytical substance to provide a comparison of alternatives, as well as provide enough information for the decision maker to determine the alternatives that would have the least and most impact to listed species and habitat resources. The use of charts, tables, maps, and other graphics to illustrate comparisons between the alternatives and their respective impacts should be used. The results of this section should be used in the alternatives matrix of the Preliminary Engineering Report, or PER. Please see Part 2, Chapter 3 of the PD&E Manual for more information about the PER. The appropriate standard statement must be included in the environmental analysis section of an EIS or EA if federally endangered or threatened species or critical habitat are not present in the action area. Any technical memos or the NRE should be summarized, referenced, and placed in the project file. Part 1, Chapter 6 of the PD&E Manual contains more information regarding documentation in an EA. correspondence with resource or regulatory agencies regarding protected species and habitat information, such as coordination letters, emails, meeting minutes, comments on technical reports, or concurrence letters, should be included in the comments and coordination section of an EA or EIS, referenced in the environmental analysis section, and added to the project file. Protected species and habitat commitments are documented in the commitments section of an EA or EIS. The PD&E Manual Part 2, Chapter 22, Commitments contains more detail on how to prepare this section of the EIS or EA. For an EA with FONSI, this protected species and habitat information must be updated after the public hearing. The findings are documented in a finding of no significant impact or FONSI according to Part 1, Chapter 7 of the PD&E Manual. For a State Environmental Impact Report, or SEER, the results of the Protected Species and Habitat Evaluation are included in the Environmental Analysis section of the State Environmental Impact Report form. Any protected species and habitat related to commitments should be included in the Commitments section. More guidance on SEER preparation can be found in the PD&E Manual, Part 1, Chapter 10, State, Local, or Privately Funded Project Delivery, and the computer-based NEPA Introductory Course, State, Local, or Privately Funded Project Delivery. Regardless of the cost of action, there may be some instances when one of the services does not have enough information to concur or not concur with an FDOT effect determination. In these cases, summarize the consultation in the Protected Species and Habitat section of the environmental document and include the reasons why it cannot be completed as described in the services letter. It is also crucial to provide reasonable assurance that the requirements will be fulfilled. Associated commitments must also be provided in the commitment section of the Type 2 Categorical Exclusion Determination Form, EA or EIS. In these instances, the appropriate standard statement should be used. Protected species and habitat commitments may include incidental take statement commitments or other actions such as an EIS construction provisions that are required to advance the project and or require action from the contractor to implement. Commitments may include the retrofitting of structures to serve as wildlife passages, building of wildlife crossings, wildlife signage, crossing structure monitoring, and protected species surveys during later phases. Commitments must be coordinated with other FDOT offices to ensure each commitment is feasible. These commitments are included in the commitment section of the environmental document. The project manager should ensure clear and concise transmittal of the commitments to the subsequent project phases, including final design and construction. Commitments related to protected species and habitat made by FDOT over the course of the project study are documented in accordance with FDOT's Project Commitment Tracking Procedure once the environmental document has been finalized. More information on documenting commitments is provided in the PD&E Manual Part 2, Chapter 22, Commitments, in the computer-based NEPA Introductory Course, Commitments. At the conclusion of consultation, the services may include conservation recommendations, which are non-binding suggestions providing separately from a BO or incidental take statement. The district should consult with district management and OEM prior to making conservation recommendations a commitment. Any change of protected species, listed species, habitat impact, or compensatory mitigation strategies after approval of the final environmental document must be documented in the appropriate reevaluation as per Part 1, Chapter 13, Reevaluations of the PD&E Manual, and the computer-based NEPA Introductory Course reevaluations. Commitments must be updated in the commitment status section, and a summary of agency coordination needs to be included in the natural resources section of the reevaluation form. Protected species and habitat commitments established as a result of the PD&E study and/or agency coordination must be documented in the project commitment record once the environmental document has been finalized. It is then transmitted to the design and construction offices to be included in contract documents and/or to be addressed through permitting. Follow FDOT's Project Commitment Tracking Procedure and PD&E Manual Part 2, Chapter 22, Commitments. The project commitment record and procedure can be found on the Policy and Process Management Unit website. A hyperlink to this site can be found on the resources page of this CBT. Protected species and habitat review during design and commitment implementation during construction consists of the following activities. Review commitments specific to protected species and habitat. Review plans received for completeness and identify or confirm project limits. Conduct on-site field reviews with appropriate professionals to confirm existing protected species and habitat resources within project limits addressed in the plans. Coordinate with resource or regulatory agencies to assess the need for any species-specific surveys and/or the most up-to-date species survey protocols. Coordinate any permitting requirements with regulatory agencies. Complete impact review by providing plans and providing comments on protected species and habitat resources identified and any resolutions that should be coordinated with the appropriate regulatory agencies or incorporated into the contract design plans. Subsequently, verify that completed final design plans and specifications incorporate required protected species and habitat resolutions into the bid documents or the request for proposals document. Ensure that the construction office verifies compliance with protected species and habitat commitments, as well as federal and state regulations incorporated into the final design. Ensure that protected species and habitat commitments not included in the permit conditions were addressed as specified in the contract plans, including modifications approved during construction. This is done by the construction office, but may require environmental office involvement on occasion. In cases where there are long-term maintenance requirements, coordinate with the district maintenance office. For example, no mow zones or weed control. Depending on the nature and scope, a maintenance agreement may be necessary. The district should verify commitment and regulatory compliance as the project advances. Additional minimization actions can be conducted during the project design phase. Project commitments may include construction conditions for protected species, specific design specifications, for example, the construction of wildlife crossings or wildlife crossing features that can minimize take, or other project-specific treatments such as exclusionary fencing or non-standard curb heights. In some cases, special provisions or modified special provisions may need to be considered. Plan notes are only used when absolutely necessary and must be project-specific and cannot repeat specifications, permit conditions, and/or standard designs. During PD&E, any potential species issues should have been addressed with resource agencies and project commitments made. Therefore, it is important that the project manager and permit coordinator coordinate during permitting. Federal permitting authority for FDOT projects typically originates from proposed impacts to jurisdictional wetlands and/or other surface waters, or from bridge or causeway construction over navigable waters of the United States. The USACE regulates the discharge of dredged and fill material into the waters of the United States, including wetlands under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. The United States Coast Guard, or USCG, administers the permitting program for bridge and causeway construction under a variety of statutes, including the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, the General Bridge Act of 1946, and other authorities. Refer to the PD&E Manual Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permits for more information. Regardless of whether the USACE or the USCG function as lead or cooperating agencies for a given federal action, the issuance of federal permits requires coordination with the applicable service as a consulting agency. They work with the permit applicant and the permitting agency to evaluate potential impacts to federally listed species and habitats following the ESA Section 7 consultation process outlined previously. As part of the permitting process, the services may request additional data, including recent species-specific field surveys, confirmation of habitat mapping and characterization, and data on any observed listed species occurrences. This information provides the facts on the ground that complement the PD&E study results. Federal permits from USACE or USCG should have a determination from the services of no effect or may affect is not likely to adversely affect federally listed species. If the action may affect is likely to adversely affect one or more listed species, then an incidental take statement authorizing incidental take should have been issued. Issuance of a state general, individual, or conceptual environmental resource permit, or ERP, from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP, or a water management district, or WMD, requires that the activity will not adversely impact the value of functions provided to fish and wildlife and listed species by wetlands and other surface waters. FDOT projects generally require a general or individual ERP. As part of the state permitting procedure for the ERPs, the WMD sends the permit application to the USACE and other agencies. The project manager and permit coordinator should facilitate the communication of relevant resource agency decisions from the PD&E study and commitments to FDEP or the WMD as part of the state permit application process. Federal and state permits may be required for unavoidable impacts to or take of protected species. Species protected by the ESA may require an incidental take permit from one of the services. The FWC also requires incidental take permits for activities that may result in take of state-listed species. These species may also be federally listed. Species such as the American bald eagle, Florida burrowing owl, osprey, and gopher tortoise are not subject to ESA review, yet may require species-specific permits during project permitting. Guidance on the most common protected species permit types required for transportation projects is provided in PD&E Manual Part 1, Chapter 12, Environmental Permits. FDOT developed FDOT contractor requirements for unanticipated interaction with protected species for use by contractors when interaction with protected species is not anticipated and the following conditions exist. A no effect determination has been made, no commitments have been made, and/or no permit conditions exist. A link to these requirements is provided in Section 7, 1.4 of the FDOT standard specifications for road and bridge construction. A link to the standard specifications can be found on the resources page. These contractor requirements address common protected species that may be encountered on FDOT projects and provide guidance in the event that a protected species is encountered during construction activities. The Construction Project Administrator, Consultant Construction Engineering and Inspection, or CCEI, contractor, project manager, and field superintendents should be reminded of these requirements during the pre-construction meeting or at the pre-proposal meeting for design-build projects. Off-project activities performed by FDOT or a contractor may impact protected species or critical habitat. Examples of such activities are borrow pits, disposal sites, concrete plants, asphalt plants, and material or equipment storage sites, also known as staging areas. Stormwater management facilities identified in project plans that have been moved since the PD&E was approved should be surveyed like the rest of the project during permitting. Off-project activities are not exempt from federal or state regulations. A field survey is required for all contractor activities which might involve federally listed species consideration in accordance with Section 7, 1.4 of the FDOT standard specifications for road and bridge construction. The survey methods described previously also apply to off-project locations and are to be performed with District Environmental Office oversight. A NRE should be completed and Section 7 consultation may be requested by the services for any activity which, through reduction of habitat or physical presence, would impact a federally listed species or critical habitat. The presence of state-listed species or otherwise protected species must also be determined in off-project impact areas. The procedures for this determination are the same as described earlier for the project area. Coordination may be necessary with both the services and FWC. At the pre-construction conference, district staff must notify the CPA that it is the contractor's responsibility to submit a written request for the district to conduct a biological evaluation of any site where off-project activities are proposed. The District Environmental Office must notify the CPA that the contractor should request necessary biological evaluations with sufficient lead time so this may be completed without delaying the related off-project activity. The written request should include the location of the activity, a map identifying haul or access roads, and a project description with project numbers. This will provide district environmental personnel the opportunity to research if any protected species are reported for the specified area. The district environmental personnel will notify the resident engineer and CPA of the scheduled arrival, date, time for the evaluation of the site. Upon completion of the field evaluation, if no species issues are identified, the district will send a written notice to the CPA stating that the contractor may proceed with the project. The district materials engineer and resident engineer should be copied. A sample letter is provided in Figure 16-8 of the PD&E Manual Part 2, Chapter 16. The district should notify the CPA if a potential listed species is identified in the off-project area and if ESA Section 7 consultation is required. If ESA Section 7 consultation is required, the district environmental office and CPA should coordinate with the contractor on how to proceed. Maintenance activities are typically undertaken without impacting protected species or wildlife habitat. District Environmental Office staff should assist the Office of Maintenance when protected species issues arise or maintenance activities that may affect protected species or wildlife habitats are planned. Examples include culvert repair or replacement in areas known to be inhabited by protected species, mowing and/or herbicide or fertilizer application on roadsides inhabited by listed plant species, bridge repair or maintenance in bridges that may be roosting sites for protected bat species, bridge repair or maintenance requiring in-water work, tree or shrub trimming in mangrove areas, or guardrail repair that may affect protected species. A field survey is required for maintenance activities which might involve federally listed species consideration in accordance with Section 7 of the Florida Department of Transportation Standard Specifications for Road and Bridge Construction. The survey methods described earlier apply to off-project locations as well as the project area and are to be performed by district environmental personnel. A NRE or technical memo should be completed and a Section 7 ESA consultation may be requested by the services for any activity which the reduction of habitat or physical presence would impact a federally listed species or critical habitat. Coordination may be necessary with both the services and FWC.
Now that we have learned how to consult and coordinate with the resource agencies at every stage of project development, it is time for our fourth and final session. Our last topic will introduce you to the legislative authority and procedure for successfully completing emergency consultation with resource agencies. In cases where emergency actions may affect federally listed species and/or critical habitats, emergency consultation with the services is required by Section 7 of the ESA. Emergency consultation guidance can be found in Sections 8.1 and 8.2 of the Endangered Species Consultation Handbook. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service defines an emergency to include an act of God, disasters, casualties, national defense, or security emergencies, and includes response activities that must be taken to prevent imminent loss of human life or property. Emergency consultation procedures allow federal agencies to incorporate endangered species concerns into their response actions. They are not intended to interfere with emergency response efforts. Consultation may be conducted informally through alternative procedures that the services director determines to be consistent with the requirements of the ESA. The key step in emergency consultation is early contact with the appropriate U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Ecological Services Office. The guidelines for emergency consultation may depend upon whether the actions take place with a presidentially declared disaster area, but generally, the initial emergency consultation procedures are as follows. The district initiates consultation by contacting the services. Written documentation of the proposed action is preferred by the services as circumstances allow. The services should respond as soon as possible, within 48 hours, by written correspondence, with recommendations to minimize the effects of the emergency response action on federally listed species or their critical habitat. Recommendations from the services may include strategies to avoid and/or minimize incidental take and conservation recommendations to help protect federally listed species and their habitats within the emergency action area. In their recommendations, the services should indicate if the emergency actions may result in jeopardy or adverse modification to federally listed species or critical habitat, and if any means for reducing or avoiding this effort are apparent. The district must implement and maintain the on-site protective measures that the services identified during this emergency Section 7 consultation. As soon as possible after the emergency is under control, formal consultation with the services must be initiated if federally listed species or critical habitat have been adversely affected. Procedurally, the emergency formal consultation is treated like any other formal consultation by the services, which means consultation must be initiated by OEM. The district should request that OEM send the following information to the services: a description of the emergency, a justification for the expedited consultation, and an evaluation of the response to and the impacts of the emergency on affected species and their habitats. This includes documentation demonstrating how the services recommendations were implemented and the results of implementation in minimizing take. After concluding formal consultation, the services will then issue an emergency BO, which documents its recommendations and the results of agency implementation of the recommendations on federally listed species. This BO also may document the actual or estimated take occurring from the emergency response actions. In addition, coordination with FWC in cases where emergency actions may affect state-listed and/or protected species is recommended. For additional information on current emergency coordination procedures, current contact information, executive orders, and best management practices, view the OEM website or the services websites. Congratulations! You have now learned all about how FDOT ensures compliance with federal and state laws that protect listed species and habitats.